Okay, I can't, it's really weird speaking without being able to see everyone. I'll just present a little bit about the People's Land Policy. We have one of our key concepts is basically land justice. And we have a quote from Win Stanley here about how important it is that, that the treasures of the earth, that these are available to all and not just a few people. And we call, that's a cover of our Working Towards a People's Land Policy document. We say that we believe in land reform from the ground up, which means that we believe in finding out what people think, coming from the grassroots to see what we want for land reform, rather than have think tanks and experts and people who put together policies that then are cascaded down rather than up from the bottom. And land is one of the most crucial issues. Who owns it? Who controls it? Who has access to it? Who makes the decisions about land use? Underlies all the issues that we're facing, whether it be the environment, housing, community, recreation, or what we're talking about tonight, which is food. And how we summarize our what we're about is People's Land Policy is a project to develop discussion and debate about what kind of land reform we need by bringing together a range of people to discuss land and the issues that affect them. We hope to contribute to the building of a broad-based radical movement for land reform. Our vision is that land is a complete ecosystem, so we need a holistic approach. Land is a commons, a source of wealth that belongs to all, and the importance of the concept of stewardship. We also believe that decision-making about land must be fully participatory and democratic and inclusive. To develop the People's Land Policy, we're trying to gather a range of ideas about what could be done, and then develop the People's Land Policy document based on what we've learned. So we've got a draft already, but it's very much a draft, and really all the seminars are part of this process. We want to work with others to campaign for change, including a Land Reform Act. So the seminar series is really to develop knowledge about the issues, to discuss what needs to be done, and to come up with policy ideas. Food is absolutely crucial, because it's so basic to everything. Over 70% of land in the UK is used for agriculture, so therefore any discussion about land needs to discuss about agriculture. And as someone said at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference, we are all eaters. So food is something that really affects us all. It's absolutely essential that we all have some kind of say in how it's produced and are able to discuss the strategy for creating things like food security and food justice in the UK and all over the world. And also agriculture impacts on so many other things, on the environment, on economic and social justice, and it's also affects people's way of life. Many people, for them, it's a way of life and their livelihood. So this is why food is absolutely crucial, and why we've decided to do this seminar series. So we've got some very interesting speakers tonight that I'm sure that you will enjoy hearing. So I'm going to call on them straight away. The first one is Jyoti Fernandes from the Land Workers Alliance, and she is a campaign and policy organizer for the Land Workers Alliance, and also a smallholder in her own right. After Jyoti, we've got Hannah Field from the University of Cumbria, but she's also involved as the coordinator of the Cumbria Inquiry for the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. So I'll hand over immediately to you, Jyoti. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's a lot of people to talk about very detailed stuff. But yeah, it's been interesting for me. I've been in meetings all day long with DEFRA, which is the Agriculture Department for the UK, because we're doing lots of working out. I'm on the advisory panel for the new ELM scheme. It's called the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is what we're going to replace the payments that used to come over for agriculture from Europe with, and working out lots of nuts and bolts about that. And so I probably might be a bit more specific in what I want to say than maybe some of you want to know, but I think it's those nuts and bolts that can actually, of what's happening with our policy, that can actually lead us towards some real land justice and, to reform some of the fundamental problems. So I'll take a step back and explain what I think some of those fundamental problems are, but I'd love to share with you some of the details of what's being bashed out about now, because I think it'll make a real difference to where we go in the future with our food system, land ownership, new entrants to farming, that kind of thing. Anyway, I am Jyoti. I have a farm in Dorset. I've had it for 17 years now. I've been farming for about 20 years, starting out as a woofer, a volunteer on farms, then going to a community farm and living there for a bit, and then getting a loan from an ethical bank and buying our own farm, our family farm, which we share with another family. So I've had some experience with that, and that whole journey for me was, it was quite difficult in many ways because there's so many barriers in the way. The price of land is very expensive. Getting the knowledge to be able to work the land and live on it's expensive. Housing associated with land is also very difficult to get, and we had to go through a long planning permission struggle in order to get planning permission to live on our land with our family and on our livelihoods as small-scale farmers. And all of those things taught me a bit of a lesson that, to change those fundamental barriers, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to change the larger system and our outlook towards land. And so that motivated me to work with some other farmers who were in the same situation, who believed in those values of the idea that, small farms producing food for your local economy, managing the land in a way that's good for the environment, are all fundamentally important things to support. I got together with some people that believed in those same things, and we started the Land Workers Alliance, which is a union for farmers, foresters, and land-based workers, because we believe that people need to work together in order to change and transform the political system that we operate in, the power dynamics of that political system, as well as support each other through solidarity, really helping each other when things get tough, sharing knowledge, being there to become stronger and more than the sum of our parts, really. And we're a part of La Via Campesina, which is a large farmers union that stretches across the globe, representing 200 million farmers or so. The farmers across the world are mostly peasant farmers, small-scale farmers, family farmers, working towards a better food system, one where power is shared more equally, where more people have access to land, and that access to land forms the basis of people's food security to be able to provide for their own food for their local economies. So we're doing a lot of work with, the farmers' protests in India, and, supporting, just all kinds of initiatives across the world, from the amazing movement that we're able to be a part of, and so lucky to be a part of. Now, looking back to the UK, what we work on, because now I work as policy coordinator for the Land Workers Alliance, we started something with the agricultural bill that was going through when Brexit was when Brexit was being discussed, because agriculture was actually a huge portion of what our relationship with the EU was about. 47% of the budget was actually for agriculture that was coming from the EU. So when we decided to leave the European Union, that meant that we were going to have to radically reform the way our agricultural subsidies were distributed. And there were a number of problems with the way they were distributed, because the common agricultural policy that came from Europe distributed subsidies or farm payments on the basis of how much land you owned. So you didn't necessarily need to produce food in order to get subsidies, but you got a payment that was roughly around £200, more or less, per hectare, for how much land you owned. And there were certain cross-compliance requirements and that kind of thing. And in many cases, that farm subsidy payment is incredibly important to farmers, because so many farmers are paid below the cost of production for what they produce. You know, the price of food very rarely, it reflects the amount of work that goes into it, or those larger ecosystem services, which is things like looking after, your fields, your hedgerows, all of that. That's not reflected in the price of food. So some sort of support payment for farmers is incredibly important. But the way it was configured also had a number of problems embodied in that, because there was things like 80% of the payments that were out there for farm subsidies actually only went to about 20% of farms. And there was a 5-hectare cutoff limit, so that if you were a below 5-hectare farm, you weren't able to claim any payments. And there was other sorts of things that caused a few problems with it. And so these are things that organizations such as the Family Farmers Association, ourselves, and various groups, we're trying to campaign to change, trying to look at an upper limit on those payments. So huge payments that are going to, very, very large established landowners, not your kind of family farms that you see in the Uplands or things like that, but these very large holdings, like the huge payments going to the Queen, those kinds of things. But there was a cap on those payments so that they could be redistributed a bit more fairly, and that smaller family farms and horticulture units could benefit from the payments, and also to look at a way that they could be correlated a bit better to the public goods that farms generate, so that if they were looking after the environment, if they were producing food, if they're looking after public health, if they're producing fresh fruit and veg, they're getting payments for doing those things rather than it just being based on how much land you own. Now, whether or not that happens, now that we've left the European Union, is another story. That was a long process. These things have been debated. There was flaws in the system, but also positive things in that it was supporting a number of farms that did need those payments in order to survive. We've changed all of that. There's been an Agriculture Act that was passed by UK government, which we did a lot of lobbying to try and change and shift so that it reflected the sort of values we wanted to see from our land use and our farming system and our food system better. Some of those were adopted, other ones weren't. And it's been a long process of trying to negotiate to get what happens with our agricultural subsidy much, much better. And that process is still very much in development. But the framework of that bill, the framework of the Agriculture Act, meant that we were going to stop the per hectare payments, which means that the payments that they call the basic payment scheme are going to be phased out and then replaced with another system for making those payments. And I know quite a lot of detail about what they're planning to do, some which I'm not allowed to say, and other ones, things that I can say and talk about. And I'd be happy for people that want to know more detail to ask me questions. But there's some fundamental things we are debating all along this process, and things that, different groups are standing up for different things. There's a large stakeholder group with about 50 different organizations there that goes through every aspect of this policy about what we're going to do. And generally, our organization, we try and stand up for making sure that below 5-hectare farms are supported, that farms that are transitioning to organic practices, that are practicing pasture-fed livestock, practices, ones in urban and peri-urban areas, ones that engage communities, that do all these things that, we think are quite good things to be a fundamental part of creating a better, healthier food system, are actually rewarded and paid for through this subsidy system. And that's quite a big transition. Horticulture has very rarely been able to claim payments because many of the horticulture farms out there are quite small. So the Landworkers Alliance, we're working on a test and trial. There's these kind of tests where we talk to loads of farmers, and you try out different ways that we might be able to reward horticulture, where we're working with 50 different horticulture farms to try and work out what sort of system would mean that they would be able to be paid for what they do. And that's going to be fed into the mix with all these other tests and trials being held by other organizations and groups to try and work out ways that their the people that they represent can be paid for the good that they do. And it's a really interesting one. Like, today, we were debating the eligibility standards for the new payments. And one of the things that came up was we were strongly supporting that farms below 5 hectares should be able to claim payments. That's your small farms, because that's a fundamental principle with land justice, that those smaller farms should actually be able to claim payments, and they should be actually worth something for the work that people on those small farming units do. And it was interesting to see who is in the group and the opposition from various groups to that principle. And a lot of it is about kind of thinking, oh, well, actually that money was promised to kind of go to the existing farming community, which is true. The existing farming community definitely needs it to be able to survive and remain financially viable, but this kind of threatening feeling that, oh, we're going to be swamped by loads of small holdings. Or when we started to discuss about whether or not the payments should be able to extend to peri-urban areas, there was a lot of, and there was talk about bringing in more diversity into who was on the panel in terms of, people of color, people from disadvantaged backgrounds, people who had not benefited previously from payments. Of course, we get quite a lot of pushback as well, where people are going, oh, well, we can't spread ourselves too thin. We can't transform the whole system. People really saying things like this. And I think it's really important to just make sure that those voices are there. And you can kind of point out and go, well, who is here? We've got the Country Landowners Association, the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England, the National Trust, some very large organizations. And what are they protecting, and what are we trying to actually outreach in a sensible way towards transforming where the payments go, land ownership, bringing new entrants into farming, bringing access to the countryside, to diverse communities, and all these fundamental principles. So, it's a lot of work, but I think it's very important to be there at the table and to be having these conversations and to be really pushing forward what we need out of land justice and a better, healthier food system throughout how our public policy on agriculture works. I don't know how long I've been talking for, but maybe I can answer questions.
Right, thank you. I mean, we were going to hear from Hannah first, I think, and then have questions afterwards. So if you're happy to start there, then we'll move on to Hannah, and then we'll open it to questions. We're keeping the chat off at the moment, so that it's not sort of distracting for everyone when people are speaking. But as soon as we open up to question and answers, then the chat will be open and people can start thinking of questions that they want to ask. So Hannah?
Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen. So I've got a presentation just to prompt me as I'm kind of sharing some kind of lived experiences from the Uplands, basically. So you should all be able to see that. Is that okay, Bonnie?
Yeah, I can see that, yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm kind of coming from a more concentrated perspective maybe than Jyoti, in terms of I'm based in Cumbria, so I'm in the Northern Lake District. I work with a lot of kind of family farmers who are based in the Uplands. As Bonnie mentioned, I'm doing my PhD at the moment, and I'm researching common land and commoning practices. And I'm also the coordinator for Food Farming Countryside Commission in Cumbria. So just a bit about me. I work on a small holding. I help look after some sheep. I grow my own food. I've been in the Lake District, in and around the Lake District for over 10 years now. So I'm fairly rooted kind of up here in the north, and my work kind of crosses over a bit into Yorkshire and like North Lancashire. So a lot of the examples and stuff I'm going to be talking about is quite Cumbria centric, I suppose. So kind of a bit of a picture of the Uplands. I'm sure everyone has their own kind of picture of what the Uplands are for them. But in terms of farming, we're talking about hills and hill farming, and that is predominantly livestock. The ground is not necessarily suitable for horticulture, although there are some horticultural kind of examples in some of the valleys and around them, but I'm going to focus a bit more on the livestock practices. And then you've got forestry, obviously a lot of recreation and other types of commercial estates. And in terms of habitat that we're talking about, there's peatlands, woodlands, open grasslands, hedgerows, and quite craggy land. And going back to common land, so commons are quite a specific way. Jyoti was talking about the large landowners that we have. So commons are quite large pieces of land, but they normally have one or two landowners. And then there's a bunch of farmers who have commons rights to be able to graze their livestock. So sheep, cattle, fell ponies. So 3% of land in England is commons, 16% of land in Cumbria is commons, and then 28% of the Lake District is commons. So it's quite concentrated up here in the northwest in terms of common land. And commons, it really requires collaboration, and there's been a historical breakdown in relationships which now need to be kind of fixed to be able to enter these new schemes, and kind of focusing on that social justice element as well as ecological justice. So this, Jyoti referred to this a bit, there's a lot of words here, but essentially what I'm looking at is the change in narrative. So what we've got asked farmers to do post-war was to intensify and maximize food production. And that's when farmers started to become a bit more reliant on payments. Farms simplified the land to make it easier to increase food production, which means that we lost a lot of ecosystems. The ecosystems were simplified, we lost a lot of species, etc. And then as we've moved through, there's been a bit of change in terms of countryside stewardship and higher level stewardship coming in the early 2000s, which kind of promoted more environmentally aware practices. However, there was still kind of support for like chemical use, etc. But now, so from this year until 2028, so we've got a 7-year window to kind of, well, not even that, we have 12 months probably to really get this design process right that Jyoti was referring to. But this change in narrative has put food as a private good, so it's marketable. And the focus is on public goods, which is really new language for a lot of people. So kind of what is a public good? So the DEFRA categories that they use, so these are where what the payments are going to be given for. So clean air, clean water, wildlife, environmental hazards, so protection from things like flooding, and then beauty, heritage engagement, so that recreation and just love of landscape, so that kind of things, paying farmers to deliver those benefits as well. And then adaptation to climate change, so locking up carbon, etc. So that's what a public good is. But in terms of people actually understanding what that is, there's a lot of communication and conversation that needs to happen to actually help farmers to understand what this means. So again, Jyoti mentioned Elm. I don't want to repeat what she's gone through, but just wanted to point out, basically there's these 3 components. So sustainable farming initiative is the basic one. Then local nature recovery, landscape recovery. So basic payment scheme is obviously going to be phased out. So that's part of the Common Agricultural Policy that was the EU policy. And sustainable farming initiative, although it's the most basic payment, it has more requirements than BPS did. As Jyoti said, BPS is just payment for having land and like keeping it in relatively good condition. And now it's becoming, you either need to kind of protect the natural assets that you've got, or improve their condition, or revitalise habitats. And then local nature recovery and landscape recovery, these ones are the higher components, and you'll get more payment for them, but they also require collaboration. So nature doesn't see boundaries. So moving beyond the single farm, people are going to be required to collaborate with their neighbours at different levels, essentially. And collaboration isn't always easy. So there's a bit of a barrier to actually access these higher payments as well. So yeah, Jyoti mentioned the tests and trials. There's 3,000 farmers and land managers kind of involved across all the different tests and trials. So it does pose like quite a good opportunity to get this right and make it fair. But there are kind of barriers to that in terms of timescale potentially at this point. They've already been developing it over the last 4 years or so, and there's still a lot of work going on to actually shape the detail. So we need to ensure good communication. And there's also this risk where we may lose a lot of family farms where they just don't have the information to be able to make the good decisions and aren't supported enough to do that. So yeah, it's an opportunity, but there is a lot of risk involved as well. So yeah, I just want to say thank you to all the farmers who I've spoken to. So the next part of my presentation is all from conversations I've had with farmers within different contexts, within the commons, individual farmers, farmer groups. And these are just some distilled bits of information from those conversations. Again, this is Uplands farmers, so Cumbria and Yorkshire mainly. So the repeated concerns is that there isn't any detail in these schemes yet. There's a broad transition plan they've called it a route map, but it actually doesn't have any detail to help farmers actually make any decisions. And with that detail needs to come support. So one-to-one advice. So every farm is different, every catchment is different, every landscape is different. So we need to be able to offer support through advisory services and expanding the advisory services that are already there. And then training in terms of, there's a lot of new skills that are going to be needed. So things like soil monitoring, habitat monitoring, mapping data, all of these sorts of skills farmers are going to need to potentially access at least, but also maybe understand themselves as well. And so, yeah, and then going back to that need to support collaboration. Collaboration isn't easy, and facilitation is actually really important. Even in a community where you know each other really well, having an external facilitator who's independent and understands what's going on is a vital piece of the puzzle, really. And provision of facilitation could be really key in actually supporting these farms going forward. And also there's been an issue historically with access to money, so payments being unreliable, irregular, payments not being made for they're a year late potentially. This is all from the farmers that I've spoken to. So yeah, there's a few issues that need to be resolved. And then in terms of responses to transition, some farmers just want to up their livestock because they don't want to sign up to another scheme with people that don't really understand their farm, basically. Others are kind of ignoring it and hoping it will all be okay. There's some people that are quite resigned to the fact that it's going to happen, but they need more information. And others really want to kind of get on board, but again, they need more information. And then again, there's people who are just getting on with nature conservation, nature recovery, and have changed or are changing their practices anyway, potentially to become less reliable on farming payments, less reliant on farming payments, or just because they feel like it's the way forward. So this is a really critical moment in terms of designing what this is going to look like and what it's going to mean for our rural communities. And then some kind of key pieces of information I sort of drew out in terms of responses, that actually some farmers have already take the action to reduce their livestock, and have also reduced inputs. So inputs being fertilizer and feed mainly, which cost a lot of money. So taking away those inputs and reducing the stock numbers have seen increased profits, improved vegetation and soil, more biodiversity. So all of these benefits they're seeing from changing the practice anyway. Another farmer I spoke to was asking whether actually now saw himself more as a carbon farmer. So a lot of the hill farms, they have a lot of peatland, and the peatland needs restoring. So actually getting payment to restore the peatland, and that could be an opportunity to access this public money, but also private finance as well. And there was quite a few I spoke to who feel like there's potential for a bright future, and spoke about kind of agroecological principles, which combine the social, cultural, economic, and ecological benefits, basically, of good, well-balanced farming systems. And then around this land justice piece, there's another big element of risk. And someone actually described it to me. They feel like it's a bit like the Highland clearances at the moment. And that's a really powerful kind of image. So what large landowners are doing is seeing this opportunity to access money for nature recovery. So potentially it's good for nature recovery, but what they're doing is raising rents and pushing more farmers out, and then or they're taking farms back in hand at the soonest kind of possible opportunity, selling off the farm, the buildings, and keeping the land. So we're seeing like a loss of just farms on potentially quite a broad scale, essentially. So there's a bit of risk around the being a tenant, basically. And obviously that will impact the rural communities massively. So I'm just going to run through some examples of farmers that are already doing more nature-friendly practices, or are kind of on the journey for doing it and have diversified their businesses. So there's a whole list there, and I'm just going to go through like some other ones that aren't on that list. So on the left, there's a new hedgerow that was planted by a farmer called Danny Teasdale, and he set up Ullswater Catchment Management CIC. So after the 2015 Storm Desmond flooding that happened, particularly in Glen Ridding, which is his local community, he went to the local farmers and was like, we need to do something about this. So they created a farmer group. They started changing their practices in terms of doing more rotational grazing. So improving the vegetation, improving soil, and he expanded this to then be planting hedgerows, planting trees on other people's land. They get contracted as a community to do work in other places in the Lake District. So this is in Glen Ridding actually, where they created a new channel for the river to mitigate flooding upstream, so it didn't reduces the potential impact on the village below. And so in the uplands, a lot of our rivers were canalised and straightened to maximise efficiency. And so Danny's work, he re-meanders rivers and things like that as well. It can be left to be done naturally, but sometimes given it a bit of helping hand, kind of supports, well, creation of habitat, spawning grounds for various different fish species, and protects the local community as well as providing local people with business. Nibthwaite Farm, so picture on the right shows their Castle Milk Moorit sheep. They've got various different heritage breeds of sheep and cows, and they run sheep on commons as well. But they've diversified into these more heritage breeds because particularly the cattle, when you graze cattle, they trample the grass and that builds soil, and their dung helps to build soil, which also increases biodiversity because they carry the seeds in their dung, and also it's good for dung beetles, amongst other creatures. So on the bottom right just shows an image from their online shop. So they produce wool, they produce soap and various different things. They have accommodation. So it's kind of diversifying and making more of a resilient business, basically. And then Dalefoot Compost. So this is quite an amazing image on the left here. This is on Bampton Common, and Dalefoot Compost, they get contracted now across the UK to do peatland restoration. So they restored this piece of peatland, and you can see what it's like now. So this is really important habitat and really important for carbon storage. But they also make compost from their sheep's wool and from the bracken. So bracken is a real issue on uplands if it's not managed properly. This is, and that compost is certified organic as well. So Hilltop Farm is actually in Malham, which is North Yorkshire Dales. You can see Neil in the corner there. And he runs belted Galloways, which you can see in the picture, and there's some Swaledale sheep there as well, so native breeds. And he reduced his stock numbers and saw massive benefits basically to business, to the soils, etc. And he's really interested in agroecological practices and how they can be rolled out to more farm businesses, and showing those benefits that you can get. So Pharma Network, they cover Cumbria and Yorkshire, and I put them here because that facilitation element is an opportunity to fund trusted intermediary bodies to actually help deliver ELM and support the farmers. So they're really trusted individuals. It's not Natural England, unfortunately, have become less of a trusted organisation. They would turn up to set up a scheme, a higher level stewardship scheme, and they wouldn't be seen again necessarily really until they were at the end of the scheme, which is 10 years. So this is just from farmers that I've spoken to. So having trusted people properly funded is really important. Now this one's a bit different. This is Nadal Farm, which is actually owned by, I think it's leased by RSPB off United Utilities, who are the water company up here. And they have just been given green recovery money to set up the first tree and wildflower nursery. So that's that image on the right, basically to kind of support this nature recovery work that needs to happen. But they also run sheep and hairy cows as well. And they're actually testing out this invisible fence system where the cows wear collars, and you can move the cows so they benefit the habitats as much as they can, essentially. So that's a trial that's just started. So an interesting one to watch. And I would say there's another project nearer to me called Wild Ennerdale, and they run cows in the woods, so agroforestry, and they're a really good example of how that works well for the farmer and for wildlife. And they're also looking to reintroduce beavers, which Wild Haweswater already have beavers in the valley. So it's pretty exciting. So that's just a bit of a different view so there's other individual farmers. I'm just trying to give kind of examples of stuff going on. This one, these are new entrant farmers, but it's a family farm. So the Claire Beaumont's family farm, and they've gone back to basically take it over. And this is a mix of rewilding and farming. So they produce high quality beef, and they chose to have cows because they started to see the benefits on the soil. So Sam, he looks at the soil, monitors the soil, and we're seeing the improvements kind of really quickly. And they took off the inputs, so they don't put fertilizer, they don't use feed for their cows, it's all produced there on site sort of thing. Yeah, so they're another good example. That's Wilder Galborough Hall Farm, and that's Ullswater, so they're literally on the banks of Ullswater just there. Yeah, and that's kind of, so just a quick run through. I'm probably gone over time, but I think it's a really good opportunity to show some examples of kind of good practice and different ways we might see the landscape used. And these agroecological principles are really useful to kind of see how what the system needs to include. And there's a lot around social, ecological, land, climate justice within this system. So it provides quite a interesting model. And it's all about kind of embracing complexity. There's a lot going on. It all needs to be place-based. There's issues around land ownership and access. We need to change diets. That's a massive thing. So there's a reliance on processed food and quite high meat content in diets. So all of these things are really interlinked, and it's really complex, of course. So I'll stop there. If anyone, really happy to have discussion, take questions, and to connect on some of this stuff. So thank you for listening to me ramble about farmers.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was really interesting and very useful. I'm gonna open the chat now so people can start putting questions in. I just need to open that you're allowed to chat. While people are thinking of questions, I'd just like to ask both of you a couple of questions. One is that seems to me that because it's so incredibly complex what they need to do, and you've got these small farmers that are now going to need to cooperate on a much wider scale. And as you were saying, Hannah, there's a risk that the large landowners are going to be in a better position to do something, to do a lot of the things that they're going to get money for, end up getting most of the money. What is the potential for farmers coming together in different areas and actually forming more, I don't know, some kind of cooperative or community farms where they're working much more closely together to help each other to fulfill some of the objectives of the ELM? That's my first question. And my second question is, we haven't really talked about people who are consuming food. And you mentioned that food is not a public good. But it seems to me that getting good quality, cheap food, so for people in Britain, so people can actually eat good quality, cheap food, is incredibly important. But I can't really see how this Agricultural Act is actually going to contribute to getting good, cheap food to local people. So if either of you would like to comment on those two questions.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's all right. Do you want to go, Jyoti?
I mean, you can. Well, yeah. I mean, Hannah did a really good job of explaining the different layers of what's coming. Yeah, the different levels of things that are working, and there's the sustainable farming incentive, which is to support farmers in the first level. But the second one is the local nature recovery, and that one is focused on collaboration. And it's really trying to get farmers to work together to try and build up initiatives that will do whatever, all different sorts of things. Some of it's managing the land together so that they can have a landscape scale project where a number of different farms are working together to restore habitats and put corridors for wildlife to go in between it, or put peatland in, or whatever it is. But also we're working with DEFRA to try to get them to study doing these things. I can't promise it's going to happen because I can't promise anything for government or DEFRA that they'll put the budget behind it. But some of that would be things like community supported agriculture, trying to get people in the local community to work together to try and get land so that they can get that land being farmed by somebody, maybe a new entrant to farming, getting them producing fruit and veg, or it could be arable crops, or it could be meat or dairy or whatever for the local community, and seeing how that might work for government to be able to support that, which is one way that it could help facilitate better access to healthy food for a cheaper price, because it would be more direct to the consumer. And other ways to try and build collaboratives that bring in access to land and nature in different ways. Now, whether or not these actually happen, I don't know, but we're putting the ideas in front of them. And there's so many tremendous examples across the UK of communities getting together to do this sort of work that we can put in front of them and say, try this, try that, let's try and inspire and get money from the government to pay for those facilitators to make these things happen.
Hannah, did you want to?
Yeah, so collaboration efforts up here, I mentioned Ullswater CIC, so that's it. They set themselves up as a community interest company, which definitively shows them kind of as collaborating and working together actually as a whole catchment. And that's also, that model of governance is also being trialled up in the Northern Cumbria through Pharma Network, supporting farmers to collaborate, bringing in a facilitator, making sure they've got access to the skills they need. I can't remember if that's a proper test and trial, but they're trying it out anyway. And what I'm actually seeing is that grassroots self-organisation is happening much quicker than any kind of government input, essentially. So people are realising what they need to do and kind of cracking on with it anyway. So there's new farm clusters popping up in various places, Westmoreland Dales, one in South Cumbria around agroforestry. So there is an element of self-organisation, but there are people that we're at risk of maybe they'll fall through the cracks, I suppose. But it's just the need to fund people like the Pharma Network and people like Danny Teaswell to Oswald to CIC. He's been brought in at other places to show how these things might be done and how he practices. So peer-to-peer learning is really important within farming communities.
An important thing to realize is all these things are being debated at the moment. Like, I mean, we had a really long session today with government going, well, how can we support these peer-to-peer networks? And there was loads of organizations going, look, you know, why is no government not committing to doing advice? Everybody's just having to do it on their own. And it is what Hannah said, you know, people are going to have to self-organize quite a bit to make this happen. And, you know, the networks are being, you know, are there that can help provide that support, but they really do need a boost. And, you know, whether we can pull that out of government or not, it's still got to happen where people do that work together. The other thing I wanted to mention that was a big subject of debate today is who the payments go to, whether it's to the tenants or the landlords. And DEFRA's firmly landing on the side of making sure it goes to the tenants, but they're trying to figure out how to put that into the law of how the contracts are made, that it has to go to the tenants, that the landlords can't be claiming the payments. It's got to go to the actual farmers doing the land management, and the dynamics of how that works legally are being worked out. But that would be the case for the sustainable farming incentive and for local nature recovery. What that clause that they're working very hard to get into place is not covering is the third one, which is the landscape recovery. And that's where we have the risk of the big landowner, you know, the landowners having huge tracts of land that they reforest and rewild and claiming the payments for those big tracts of land. You know, but we have to balance that as well against the fact that that kind of needs to happen. We do need large scale landscape recovery, but how we get that landscape recovery, all the trees we've got to plant in order to sequester the carbon that we need to, you know, to do, where do they need to be, you know, and overall we've got to have a bit less livestock and a few more trees and that kind of thing. But how do we do that so that across the landscape and supporting as many farms as possible, not big landowners claiming loads of payments and getting loads of carbon sequestration money and carbon offset money and all of that, you know. Yeah, so the danger lies in that big, large landscape scale transformation. If it's publicly owned land, maybe that's a different story. If it's national parks, it's a different story to an individual landowner. I don't know.
I think we better try to bring this event to a close since we're 10 minutes away from 9 o'clock. I think we're going to pass over to Richard, who's going to finish off with a few comments. Where's Richard?
Yes, thanks a lot, Alec. They're not so much comments, but everyone might be wondering, well, what happens next, and how can we continue this discussion and do more about these issues. So we before we all leave, we did want to really promote the work that we're doing on a people's land policy. We'd really like you to have a look at the document if you haven't had a chance to look at it before. It's fairly short, but it really tries to integrate many issues to do with the land. So, you know, whether it's ecosystem or whether it's different types of land ownership, issues around commons, issues around housing, as well as food, of course. So we'd really like your feedback on what you think about our emerging people's land policy. At the moment, what we say about agriculture is fairly headline, which is exactly why we've had this seminar and the future seminars. We really are developing our evidence and a lot more detail that we can be adding to the people's land policy as we go along. Our ultimate aim, which may sound ambitious, but we really feel there needs to be something like a Land Reform Act in England, like they had in Scotland, which really brings together all these issues and all the linkages between them in a way that's much more about putting people and justice at the centre of questions about land. So that's our aspiration. But to do that, we need to produce a more detailed policy document. and we also need to really develop the movement, as it were, so that we're a lot stronger together. And obviously, the whole point of putting on an event like today, and we're basically a number of community groups that have put on the event today, and the whole point is to bring these discussions to a wider community level audience. And hopefully many of you who have come today might feel interested in having a look at our work. So please have a look at the People's Land Policy. Please send us any comments you have or ideas about how we could develop the policy. And we will send out an invitation for you to join us in further discussions as we produce more detail in the document. So Bonnie will be sending out information about that and asking for further feedback from you on today. So I think over to you, Bonnie, perhaps to advertise the next seminars a bit more.